Dallas, and we're getting close to the end here. We have two more left, including tonight. So we appreciate all of you that have joined us for some of the series, all of the series, or for just tonight. We're very excited to have y'all as part of our virtual Summer Sizzlers programming this year. So now I wanted to introduce Irene Allender, our Membership and Programs Director, who's going to introduce our speaker for this evening.
So good evening, everybody. I'm so glad that you guys could come and meet us. So tonight we've got Wrestling with Fire, Destruction and Resurrection of Dallas's Sportatorium with Brandon Murray. And Brandon is a certified archivist working at the Dallas History and Archives Division at the Dallas Public Library. He was born in El Paso, raised in Fort Worth, and he's got a Bachelor of Arts in History from UT Arlington and a Master's of Library Information Science from the University of North Texas. His previous experiences include 2 years of digitization and cataloging of special collection items from the Norwick Center for Digital Solutions at SMU. And on behalf of the Dallas Public Library, he writes a series of Dallas history blog articles for D Magazine called Tales from the Dallas History Archives about items from the library's historic photo collection. And so next week, don't miss our very last session. We've got Defend the Adobes with Sandro Canavas. It should be a really great session. It was rescheduled from the beginning of September. So I really hope that you guys can come and join us for our last session. And so I welcome you, Brandon.
Good evening, everybody. I'm glad to be here, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about this particular piece that I have created. Originally, this was written for an article that was published in the spring 2020 Legacies History Journal. And there was also a conference in January in which I was a presenter. So that was presented then. It was a little bit shorter than the one that you're going to get tonight, but I'm going to elaborate the slides with some additional sources that I have and some original context that I have in print form that I'm going to read as well to you and discuss some other things that weren't originally in the version that I did for Legacies. So let's get started. At 12:35 a.m. on Friday, May 1st, 1953, on the corner of Cadiz and Industrial Boulevard in Dallas, a 5-alarm fire consumed the sports palace known as the Sportatorium. Excuse me. The night fire dispatcher, A.C. Croson, reported that over 100 firefighters were called to help extinguish the blaze. The building was originally meant to hold 6,400 seats, and its original insurance price was $52,500, according to Ed McLemore, who was the promoter and the head of the Cadiz Corporation, which owned the Sportatorium. The interesting thing about this photograph you'll notice is that there is actually a person sitting in the middle of the rubble of the fire. And if you look at the next slide, you can see I zoomed in, and he's sort of taking a very casual pose, as well as I think there's a cat there with him, which is kind of weird. But this is literally one of my favorite photographs that we have in the archives collection in the library, which is where I found this. The Dallas Morning News described that the true death knell of the Sportatorium actually occurred prior to the fire in March of 1953, when Sarah T. Hughes, which I believe was also the judge who swore in LBJ after Kennedy was assassinated, ruled that the Sportatorium was actually built on land that was not owned by the Sportatorium and its owners. It was part of the county levy improvement district, and so that she said that basically they had to tear it down and rebuild it in order to address the fact that they were actually, 1/3 on state-owned land. As early as the next day of the fire, Cox, who was in a hospital at the time, was saying that it was arson and he vowed to rebuild. Ed McLemore, also stated that he wanted to rebuild, and that during that time, while they were rebuilding, that they would move the Sportatorium acts, which were a combination of music shows and wrestling and boxing matches, to the livestock building of the Fair Park. And then it's interesting to note that in a newspaper article, McLemore is quoted as saying the rebuilding plans, quote, would be slightly east of the old structure and would extend farther south. So it's interesting to note that they had already planned to use this accident as a way to sort of fix their problem with the state by rebuilding it, a little bit over, and so that it wouldn't be 1/3 on the state-owned land. So it's very interesting that sort of solved that problem for them. There's a number of different strange coincidences that pop up in relation to this fire and the aftermath, as well as what happened before. So a week after the fire, Hal Hood, who's the Dallas County Fire Marshal of the time, announced that it was arson that caused the blaze. But even before that, the Sportatorium owners were pretty clear that they believed it was. So a little bit of background on the Sportatorium itself. It was originally reported to cost $40,000. It was opened on December 9th, 1935. Its original promoter was Bert Willoughby, and the venue was designed to be for wrestling, boxing, basketball, indoor circuses, conventions, and what they called quote, style shows, unquote. It's interesting to note also that they've had a number of legal issues prior to, that ruling of them being on state-owned land, all the way back to, as far as I could find, 1937. So within 2 years of being, not even 2 years of being open, they had a judge with the 101st Judicial District of Dallas rule that they had to change the way they did endurance contests. So endurance contests, if you're not familiar with that, were things that were done to promote venues or sponsors. Radio stations often did them too, where like you could win a car if you were the last person to keep your hand on the car, things like that. So the person that did a task the longest would win the prize. So apparently, and I wasn't able to verify the inciting incident of this in my research, but from the ruling, it was declared that they were not allowed to have a contest that lasted longer than 24 hours, and they couldn't schedule multiple contests within 168 hours of each other at the same location. So obviously, there must have been some logistical and or maybe health problem that occurred relating to these at some point, but I'm still hoping to find out the origin of that legal case. But I thought it was an interesting tidbit of sort of their legal issues that they had earlier on. Just 1 second. In 1939, Ed McLemore became the active promoter of the Sportatorium instead of just the owner of the building. And so by 1946, he had a regularly scheduled country music variety show that was on Saturday nights at the Sportatorium. In 1948, McLemore arranged with KRLD to basically broadcast the show, and using their radio host Johnny Hicks, who rebranded the show as the Big D Jamboree, which officially made its debut under that name in October 16th, 1948. Among the musical acts featured on the Jamboree were, during its run, were Elvis, Johnny Cash, Lefty Frizzell, who was a very big influence on Merle Haggard, Ray Price, and Hank Williams. By the mid-1960s, the Big D Jamboree had closed down, despite a brief attempt to resurrect it by McLemore's son-in-law, George Baum, around 1970. His attempt to do that did not really go over well and last long. So this photograph is very interesting. And I want to point out, too, that all the photographs that are in this PowerPoint presentation come from the historical photograph collection in the Dallas Public Library, We have a number of different photographs on all kinds of different subjects, and there's a lot of different things of the Sportatorium, many of which I didn't even include in here, including a number of boxing matches and whatnot. But in this particular photograph, I thought it was interesting to note that this was a prize that they did for fans of the Big D Jamboree, where they gave away 3 of these Henry J. Vagabond automobiles. And you can see Macklemore there on the far left, as well as 2 other individuals, Billy Jack Saucier and Jim Yoden. And this was taken in 1952, which is before the fire. Oh, excuse me. Okay. So Macklemore often utilized a lot of charitable events to raise money. He was very charitable in a lot of things that he did. One of his favorite things to do was raise money for the March of Dimes. And he did an annual charity event that coincided with the anniversary of when he became a promoter at the Sportatorium. And he would do a wrestling show every year on the anniversary of that. And so the 13th anniversary, which was in January of 1952, featured a bout between wrestlers Duke Keomoka and Sterling Dizzy Davis for the 3rd straight year. And the previous event actually raised $5,000, despite the fact that they had weather issues and a number of different things that almost ruined the show. But it was an annual event that was a very big deal, and they consistently raised a lot of money for this charity and a number of others. And you can see in this photograph, he's actually talking to somebody with the March of Dimes about the show they've planned. Okay. So the thing that's interesting that I wanted to point out too is that the wrestlers that frequented the Sportatorium were also not immune to their own sort of publicity and controversy as well. Duke Keomoka specifically was a fond of controversy and publicity for the Sportatorium and for Macklemore. He not only was purported to have ruptured a blood vessel in Dizzy Davis's neck in early January 1952 when he did a judo chop, but he was also forced to pay court costs of $100 by the Justice of the Peace in response to physically attacking wrestling announcers Charlie Boland and George Preston during the Sportatorium show. And you can see in this photograph, he's actually being handcuffed by authorities for this assault. So it's not clear really if this was a spontaneous event where he actually did intend them harm, or if this was sort of a staged thing. But the fact that they had these kind of events that occurred fairly regularly, whether or not there was police called, but just these outrageous wrestling matches and all kinds of different things popping up. It's really built the mystique of what the Sportatorium was, and Macklemore really kind of tried to get the most out of that as he could as a promoter. So this is where things start getting interesting in relation to the lead up to the fire. So in December 10th, 1952, wrestlers went on strike against Macklemore over Texas television broadcasting rights. So they said, the wrestlers did, that Macklemore repeatedly violated an agreement. They promised them $5 per airing of the matches they appeared in, and limited broadcasts of telecasts were diminishing the gate receipts that they were entitled a portion of, as well as keeping advertising money away, which was supposed to help pay the wrestlers. So Macklemore also got into a feud with Houston booking agent Morris Siegel, and so this is where the National Wrestling Alliance comes into play, and that was a large, very powerful organization especially in the 50s in the United States that really controlled a lot of the wrestling, the booking and the promotion of wrestling matches at a lot of different venues throughout the country, to the point where in 1956 there was an antitrust lawsuit that was brought against them in the United States versus the National Wrestling Alliance, in which they were purported to have been in such control over the wrestling industry that they actually could blackball and ruin the careers of wrestlers and promoters who defied, you know, the wishes of the alliance. And so that was part of the issue, because Morris Siegel was a member of that alliance, as was Macklemore originally, and they had rather cantankerous dealings at various conferences and meetings prior to the fire over the broadcasting rights. Morris Siegel definitely wanted a cut from that. So as you'll see here, and then a number of other things were happening at the same time as well. So December 29th, 1952, a lawsuit was filed by Red Berry and 7 of the wrestlers against several defendants, which including KRLD, Macklemore, promoter named Sarpopoulos, Texas Wrestling, and the judge ruled in favor of the wrestlers, that they were not being compensated fairly. So Macklemore's response to this was to sort of do what very few people had the guts to do, which was boycott his association with the National Wrestling Alliance, also the Texas Wrestling Agency, and Morris Siegel, the Houston promoter. So beginning in January 6, 1953, Macklemore started using a series of what was called, quote, independent grapplers and previously unknown wrestlers. And so a notable wrestler that came about because of this, and actually influenced the Sportatorium's life over the next several decades, was he approached Jack Barton Atkinson, who is very well known under another name, to become a professional wrestler. And he made his wrestling debut under his original name in January of 1953. And by the end of the year, he was wrestling under the villainous name of Fritz von Erich. And then he became a very well-known professional wrestler and had a number of dealings with Macklemore, which I will discuss shortly. But I just want to point out, this is another one of my favorite photographs that I came across, is of Joe Marlowe, who was an Irving wrestler. He was not, you know, a well-known like star or whatever, but he was a local guy who, you know, was starting out, you know, in the Sportatorium, and it was, I guess, through this time period that he was able to get in and do wrestling under, you know, Macklemore's promotion. I just think it's really kind of a interesting image. You know, the guy's obviously big, and you can see he's got that tattoo there on his arm. But something about it just always kind of amused me. All right, so excuse me. On May 22nd, 1954, the Texas Wrestling Agency, Siegel and Macklemore finally gave into a last-ditch, you know, effort to end the feud because it was a two-month pressure campaign by the National Wrestling Alliance to settle their dispute. So this was after the fire had already happened. So after the fire had already happened, they finally made an agreement to where instead of giving Siegel 75% of the profits from the wrestling TV promotion, they agreed in a 50-50 split, which Macklemore, from what I've read, was still not happy about, but we felt at least was more reasonable than what Siegel originally wanted. And so just keep in mind, you know, the fact that Morris Siegel was from Houston when I get into more of the details of the fire. All right, so now we're actually going to delve into the arson and its investigation. So on August 21st, 1953, you remember the fire was on May 1st, Sheriff Decker disclosed the arrest of 4 individuals in connection with the fire, and charges were filed against 3 of them. So first was Alfred Huey McCrory of Louisiana. He was arrested in California on August 14th and charged with attempted arson. In his 5-page confession, McCrory admitted to his involvement in an aborted attempt to burn down the Sportatorium in January of 1952. And he originally agreed to be paid $100, but he chickened out. I'm going to get into more of that specifics in a moment. Roy Tatum, age 26 of Houston, had arson charges filed on Thursday, the 20th, was arrested in Chicago the next morning at the Hilton Hotel where he worked. He was an assistant manager of the food storage department, and they flew him to Dallas on Friday evening. And so the purported mastermind of the fire was a man named William Theodore Bill Moncrief. He was from Denton County, town of Aubrey. And he was the one that they all named as the guy that paid them to burn down the Sportatorium. Moncrief was described in news articles as, quote, an ex-convict with a long record of arrests. So Bill Moncrief, as far as the conspirators were concerned, was the main person behind the Sportatorium, and he was the one that paid them, he was the one that paid them to actually go through with it. And so sort of he was the head honcho there. And when I get into this, I'm going to mention as well that there was a number of instances in the appellate document that I found when of Moncrief's that lead you to believe that he might have been working on behalf of another person. So apparently, after the fire, there was after they started the fire and they fled the scene, they went to a person's house, and he made a phone call in which he told someone, apparently on the phone, something to the effect of mission accomplished. So it's not clear about whether or not he was just bragging about it, or he was letting someone know that he had completed the task that he was asked to do. So let's see. To get more specific about the actual event here, in January of 1953, Moncrief offered Jack Ragsdale, Bill Cook, and McCrory $100 to burn down the Sportatorium, but they refused. And then later, Ragsdale testified that he had seen Tatum with Moncrief in the American Grill in Houston. So after they had originally turned it down, he, being Ragsdale, had noticed that those two of them were still, meeting together even after. So it kind of corroborates that they had not ended their association prior to the fire. So McCrory actually traveled with a woman named Alice, Moncrief and Moncrief to Dallas from Houston in January, and was going to be paid by a mysterious person named Tony in Houston for using 2 5-gallon tanks of gas to burn down the Sportatorium. But he purportedly lost his nerve at the last minute, and he left the fuel at the arena, which apparently was found that night by Macklemore and others that work at the Sportatorium. They didn't know where they'd come from. So when the fire happened in May, one of the things that Macklemore pointed out was that they had already noticed that there were these, gas cans from a few months earlier they found, and so they had been sort of a little bit on edge since then. But apparently that was from him not having the nerve to go through with it. Tatum testified that Moncrief offered him $100 in April at the American Grill, which would confirm what Ragsdale testified to. And then Moncrief's conspiracy to commit arson trial ended on December 9th, 1953, when after 40 minutes of deliberation, the jury issued a guilty verdict. The judge then gave him 5 years in prison. Tatum received a 2-year sentence for arson and a 2-year sentence for conspiracy to commit arson to be conserved concurrently. And McCrory was freed from his 5-month Sinton County jail and given 2 years of probation. So it's also interesting to note, I don't think I had it in here, but when everyone was arrested, the only one that was actually able to post bail was Moncrief. So he wasn't in jail the whole time waiting to go to trial. The other folks didn't have it so easy. So another thing that's interesting to note is that when the trial happened, apparently according to the appellate documents that I found, the only two, they really only had 2 witnesses that the defense called, and they mainly asked were trying to question the ownership of the Sportatorium and then its lease and some other like legal aspects of like who owned and operated the building. It really wasn't even in defense of like trying to say he didn't do it or, you know, like where he was. It was more about challenging something related to the building's ownership, which I found really bizarre, frankly. But let's see. So the other thing to note is that he apparently, when they read the verdict, Moncrief, who didn't testify on his own behalf or say anything, just gave the jury a scowl. Although if I was going to get 5 years in prison, I probably wouldn't be happy either. So I found a death certificate from the Department of State Health Services for a William Theodore Moncrief of Fort Worth, according to the certificate, that died at the hospital for the Texas Department of Corrections in Huntsville, Walker County, at the age of 59. So he died on July 3rd, 1974. So the ages line up with the age that Moncrief was when he was arrested and sentenced to the 5-year sentence. And considering that he was a career criminal, although I was not able to verify this is definitely him, it is feasible that he actually, you know, did return to prison after that, serving that 5-year sentence. And so from my indications of research, I was able to kind of pretty much, you know, pin down that this is most likely the same Moncrief as the one that was involved with the Sportatorium fire. So there wasn't an autopsy performed, but the cause of death was listed as lymphosarcoma cell leukemia with arrested military tuberculosis. He also had, it's interesting, he was listed as an upholsterer in the articles when they arrested him, but his primary occupation at the time of his death was as a heavy equipment operator in the construction industry. And during his stay in Huntsville, as of his death, he was there for 2 years, 3 months. And he was interred at Captain Joubert Cemetery on July 7th, 1974. And I found a cemetery grave entry for a William Moncrief that coincides with that. So from what I've been able to tell, that is the same William Moncrief that was involved with the fire. So he did not have the easiest life, it looks like, and died in prison. So they were able to actually reopen the Sportatorium. They rebuilt it. Originally, if you noticed earlier in the map that I had up, the Sanborn map, I forgot to mention, the Sportatorium was an octagonal-shaped building. So it was a giant octagon. And the 1950s Sanborn map that was an update to the 1921 map actually showed a giant octagon there in Cadiz and Industrial. When they rebuilt the Sportatorium, the internal part of it was still an octagon, but the external shape they built around it wasn't exactly the same shape. But they kept it, the octagon as an internal shape. I admit that I had never actually visited the Sportatorium when I was younger. So having discovered this piece of history, in my 30s, after it was already gone, is a little bit of a bittersweet thing, because I would have loved to have been able to see it in person. So the grand reopening was in September 22nd, 1953. They were still doing some construction on the building, but it was in good enough shape that they felt like they could reopen. So they had a wrestling show, and they presented awards to Ed McLemore, including a horseshoe-shaped bouquet. They gave him flowers on behalf of the March of Dimes, thanking him for his fundraising service. The Kiwanis Club of Dallas gave him a plaque. And then they also presented a plaque to heavyweight wrestler champion Stanislav Zabisco in honor of his 75th birthday. And so you can see here in this photograph, this in the distance is the Sportatorium as it was after they rebuilt it. The focus of this photograph was actually another part of the street that they were trying to depict for, I think it was some sort of easement issue, according to the photograph. Condemnation, condemning the property. So the Sportatorium wasn't the actual focus of the photograph, but you can still clearly see it in the background. Okay, so this is actually a clip from KXAS. So this is actually a news clip from that describes the opening. And what I have here is a draft of the dialogue that was spoken by the news reporter when they broadcast the report. There's no sound on this reel. It's just the film clip, and so I will play the clip for you after I read you their description of the events. So, according to KXAS and this draft report that was put online thanks to UNT's portal to Texas history, we can now say that see what they actually were talking about during the film clip. So, at the busy intersection of Cadiz and Industrial Boulevard in Dallas, a new Sportatorium arena opens for business nearly 5 months after the old Sportatorium burned to the ground. The Sportatorium is a wrestling arena owned by promoter Ed McLemore, although not completely. The arena is far enough along to accommodate an opening night crowd. These films, taken by Texas News cameramen in the early hours of May 1st, show the blaze that destroyed the old Sportatorium. Fire officials at the time hinted at the possibility of arson, and last month arrested 3 men in connection with the case. They have since been indicted, have not been brought to trial. Obviously, the trial happened later, and we all know the result of that. Okay. The 20-year-old structure became a blazing inferno seen for miles around. Not a piece of building was saved. Wrestling in the new Sportatorium opened last night. The matches had been held at a building on the State Fairgrounds in East Dallas. Between matches, promoter McLemore on the right is presented a horseshoe of flowers by 2 young polio patients. The patients honor McLemore for the several performances he has staged to benefit the March of Dimes campaign. McLemore also gets a plaque from George Smith, president of the South Dallas Kiwanis Club. Also on hand is one-time heavyweight wrestling champion Stanislav Zabisco, who received a plaque in honor of his 75th birthday. The new Sportatorium opens for business. So now I'll play the clip for you so you can see actually what they're talking about. Again, there is no sound. So that's the Sportatorium that they rebuilt. They were still trying to finish it, so there's still some exposed. And that's the fire on May 1st. It's pretty impressive, even in black and white. From all reports, it seems like that was not an easy blaze to put out. So that's McLemore there in the dark suit holding that item. There's the horseshoe wreath. They're presenting him with the plaque. And that is Stanislav Zabisco. And that's the end of the video. It's interesting to note, before we move on, that Zabisco actually told people that were in the government when they were investigating the National Wrestling Alliance for the antitrust lawsuit, that they should talk to McLemore because he was one of the few people that had sort of borne the brunt of the ire of the National Wrestling Alliance. They actually had a competing wrestling show that they started up in Fort Worth, to kind of try to take away business from Macklemore when he was refusing to use the NWA wrestlers. So Zbyszko was involved with, kind of trying to be, was testifying against the NWA as well. So the new and improved Sportatorium was not without its issues. So the sound system originally installed had acoustical problems and resulted in it being replaced with a $10,000 Circusonic sound system that was designed by acoustics consultant and SMU professor of physics, Dr. Wayne Rudmose, which debuted in September of 1954 at the Big D Jamboree Saturday night music show. The Sportatorium installed, according to the Dallas Times-Herald, who reported that in September of that year. The Jamboree evolved in the 50s to include more rockabilly and rhythm and blues performances. That included Elvis and the February 19th, 1955 show with headliner Sid King and the Five Strings. Macklemore actually had an in-house publishing company called Big D Music, where he did music management, road shows, and booking. He did artist publicity. But by the mid-1960s, the Big D Jamboree had closed down. As I mentioned before, his son-in-law tried to bring it back briefly in 1970, but it didn't really work. It's also interesting to note that there were a number of instances that I found in my research of violence that occurred at different Sportatorium events by people that attended outside the arena. One instance is a stabbing that occurred in July of 1957. 3 people were apparently stabbed after a rock and roll show. Bill Plummer of Fort Worth was hospitalized in serious condition with, quote, knife wounds in his heart. So one of the things that kind of bothered me about this report was that a day or two later, they picked up an African-American man that they said was the guy that stabbed everybody. And 2 of the people that were involved as witnesses claimed that they went over there because they went over and saw that the African-American person who was unnamed in the report was accosting the stabbing victims, and they wanted to go see what was going on. And so they pointed out this man was the one that did the stabbing to the police when they brought him in. And then ultimately, one of the witnesses decided not to, stick with his story, and it really was kind of a very suspect report of whether or not this was actually very accurate as far as this man's guilt. And apparently, UNT agreed because one of the subject keywords they used for that particular news report entry and the Portal text history was racism. So that seemed to them like, as it did to me, that was a purported thing of someone being accused of a crime they more than likely didn't commit. So another thing that occurred a lot was Macklemore, again, trying to do various ways of promoting himself and the Sportatorium. He did a thing which I think is really cool. He started a wrestling magazine called Wrastlin', which is one of the greatest names ever for any kind of magazine in the history of the world, if you ask me. And this March 24th, 1959 issue, you can see that he arranged what he called the dream match of the decade between Pat O'Connor, and he had O'Connor and Ray against Ray Gunkel, and he guaranteed a rematch to whoever won, and that the title was worth a conservative $50,000 a year. So this was one of many different things that he did to promote the Sportatorium. You can see there the cover page of that, which I thought was really kind of funny and neat. And he apparently published quite a bit of those, and that was just one that happened to be in an archival collection that I found. Another important thing I mentioned before, Fritz von Erich, who was born Jack Atkinson, grew in notoriety, and over the years, he began working with Macklemore more and more. And by the time that in the mid '60s, their mutual respect for each other ended up leading to them creating, a booking venture together. So Atkinson was personally mentored by Macklemore and promoting and booking. He eventually took charge of the company when Macklemore had a heart attack in February of 1968. So Fritz von Erich wrestled for a number of years, even after taking over sort of the administrative parts of the booking and promoting for Macklemore. And so in '68, Macklemore had the heart attack, and then Atkinson's father, Ed Watt, his father, helped take over management as well. And Ed Watt helped take over as the front matchmaker for the Dallas Wrestling Club during the 1970s. So basically, Ed Watt helped kind of make some of the booking and matchups, but really the person behind the scenes doing a lot of the management was Atkinson and his father. And you can just see another interesting picture there of Duke Kiyomuka, which that guy I thought was a very interesting wrestler. And so one of the things that I want to mention here is that Macklemore died a year later in January of 1969. So according to his obit, he had just achieved his lifelong dream of being able to buy a Rolls-Royce automobile. So right before he died. So I found that really funny and interesting that was one of his life goals, was to own a Rolls-Royce, and he did it right before he died. So according to the Polk City Directory for Dallas in 1973, Mrs. William Griffith was president of the Sports Promoters Corp, which owned the Sportatorium, and that was actually Macklemore's daughter. So by the '70s, Macklemore's daughter was actually the one that owned the building, where Atkinson was with Fritz von Erich was in charge of doing a lot of the promoting and managing, but the building was owned by Macklemore's daughter. And then things changed hands as a lawyer from Arlington named Pearson produced a wrestling show at the Sportatorium between 1992 and '94, but it closed for good in 1998. The owner of the liquor store across the street, named Kwang Soon Chong, assumed the lease of the Sportatorium, but wasn't able to actually open it because it was going to cost him too much money to meet the required improvements by the city of Dallas to reopen it. And then by February of 2003, the Sportatorium was being demolished, and the spot, the street is now Riverfront Boulevard, and there's now nothing there. Although right before the Legacies conference that I attended to give this presentation, a real estate developer that was involved with the south side of Lamar buildings bought the land for possible development. But as far as I know, nothing has actually been planned for the site, but it actually does have a new owner now, the land does. Interesting enough, a couple of things that happened before it was demolished was that they had to do asbestos abatement. So there apparently was a large asbestos issue with the roof shingles of the building. So that is the end of the presentation. I want to point out one other thing that wasn't in there is that in the early '90s, one of the last music performances that occurred was a Beastie Boys concert that happened there. The Beastie Boys actually brought in their own sound equipment, and it was so loud that the news article that ran afterwards said that the entire building was vibrating, that the shingles were shaking, and everybody was kind of concerned that the building was getting a little taxed out there. But that, to me, that was one of the more interesting things that they that still tried to do, to book interesting events. And then I seem to recall also that when they had the Republican convention here in Texas in '92, that the Saudi Arabian delegation actually made a point of wanting to stop over to the Sportatorium during their travels to actually catch a show. And I believe that George H.W. Bush was with them. So that's another sort of fun interesting event that happened there as well. But that is the long and short of the life of the Sportatorium.
All right. Well, thank you, Brandon. I really appreciate that.
No problem.
Let's see. Okay, so I have one question. So who is a landowner who sold the land to Southside and Lamar owners?
I'm not. I think I wasn't able to find information about who owned the land currently. The article that I've got the article here that published in the morning news. Let me see if I can find that. One second. It was Jack Matthews is the guy that bought it in January of this year. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't. The article that I found didn't say that, and I wasn't able to verify that prior to this. But I do want to look into this. I'm hoping to turn this into to a larger work, either a book or something like that as well. Because this is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's really as far as like all of the events and the intrigue that has occurred over the years in the Sportatorium, and I really think there's a larger work that should be done relating to this. So
Wonderful. And see, I have one other question. Are there stories of the mob or their involvement on both sides of the fire?
So it's from what I read. So there's a book on the National Wrestling Alliance, and it's sort of dealings and nefarious behavior that I found that was really beneficial. And so it's sort of, from what I read of the book, because it sort of talks about the National Wrestling Alliance on a national level, that they really just strong arm, they use their influence to strong arm promoters and wrestlers into doing what they wanted and being able to control who performed and where and for what money. And if they didn't, then they would make sure that they couldn't get booked anywhere, because they actually had a lot of influence over all of different venues across the country. So I couldn't find anything about the mob specifically, but definitely one of my theories is that that Morris Siegel or someone that was connected to him was involved in hiring Moncrief to get someone to do the fire. I really think there was somebody else that was the mastermind of the fire besides Moncrief, but I wasn't able to find anything specific. But even back then, they were making references to like that person named Tony and other, that mission accomplished phone call. So obviously there was some other things going on that weren't really fleshed out. And I think it's important to note that Moncrief never admitted to anything. He never gave them any information. He basically just shut up and said nothing the entire time. So all the information that we have about who said what and who did what were from the underlings that he hired, who caved fairly quickly in order to sort of try to see if they get lighter sentences.
Interesting. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay. Well, I thank you so much, Brandon, for presenting to our group. We really appreciate it.
No problem.
And I thank everybody for showing up tonight. We hope to see you next week for our final summer Sizzler on Defend the Adobes.
I want to put out one thing if I can.
Yes.
The Legacies article that I wrote that has a little more information is available through, I believe they have a website where you can contact them to get copies of that article as well.
Okay, great.
It's the spring 2020 issue.
All right, sounds great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brandon. I really appreciate it. We'll see everybody later. Bye-bye.